Welcome to what is the formal launch of a new fighting publication called Art Cities of the Future, 21st Century Avant-Garde, which is happily being launched in Johannesburg as the first leg of its international distribution. And what the publication does is that it has identified 12 cities around the world as representing art cities of the future, and that is something that I'm going to be asking the artists here to comment on. But its subtext is that it's 21st century avant-gardes, and that's something I'd like to comment on and explore as well. I'd like to just introduce the artists that we're incredibly pleased and privileged to have with us this evening. I also, just before I do that, there seems to have been some misconception raging on Twitter last night that Johannesburg was number 5 on the list of selected cities. Actually, there was no qualitative list. It just happens that alphabetically it was number 5. So to dispel any kind of concerns that there might have been regarding the status of city versus another city, Bogota happens to be first because it begins with B. Johannesburg goes slightly further down the alphabetical list. So to start with, I'm going to start from my extreme left. We have some of the artists that have been curated into the Johannesburg section of the publication, and then we're also incredibly privileged to have one of the Lagos artists here with us. But on the extreme left, there is Minette Vari. Next to her, Temitayo Ngumbi. I think I pronounced that slightly wrong. Okay. We have Dineo Bopape and Zonda Blom. We were going to have Tracy Rose with us. Unfortunately, she's been held up at an exhibition in Berlin, so she won't be able to join us this evening. But what I thought that would be useful for us to explore this evening is the idea of what constitutes an art city of the future. It's quite a bolshy statement to make in terms of one city overriding the potential of another. And it is, in terms of the editorial profile, Carrie Rittenbach, who has edited the volume, was really looking for cities globally that represent something beyond the status quo, something that challenges, something that is prepared to risk, something that reflects upon its own currency as a contextual domain, something that reflects upon the discussions that are happening in and around it as a context, but also globally. And for me, it's really exciting to see the other cities that are included in the book. There's Beirut, Bogota, Cluj in Romania, Delhi, Istanbul, Johannesburg, Lagos, San Juan, Sao Paulo, Seoul, Singapore, and Vancouver. And those span really, they span the global network, but even North America, where a place like Vancouver can be included as well, and yet not clearly in this context be thought to not constitute the mainstream. And so I'm just going to throw out some ideas in terms of my understanding, and then I'd like us to have a discussion in terms of your individual perspectives on what you feel constitutes you being an artist of the future, and being an artist, I mean, there's something vaguely sci-fi to that, and you're not required to do any production changes at this point, but it is really about considering what is the sustainability of art as a general project. How does art continue to find niche considerations that remain interesting, that remain challenging, and that are not merely repetition? Which brings me to the subtitle of the book being 21st Century Avant-Gardes, which, when this was proposed to me, was in fact quite a confusing term. For me, the notion of the avant-garde feels like a bit of an anachronism. You know, we speak about the avant-garde in terms of the early 20th century, things that were really moving out of the salon beyond the formal art structures and challenging how, where, and what art could be about. And I think that, for me, is a critical part of the framing of an art city of the future. So what constitutes such a city? It would need artists, first of all. There would need to be an audience. It requires a market. It requires infrastructure, including galleries, institutions, formal, informal spaces where art can be made and shown. It requires critical dialogue, various fora where there is the opportunity and the requirement to actually engage with the work, because otherwise art in a vacuum ceases to actually exist beyond its own making, which is, in my mind, a great tragedy. And then the freedom to express, critique, comment, be affiliated or independent, the freedom to innovate beyond the assumed requirements of markets, of the market, of galleries, consumers, funders, patrons, and art fairs in this instance, without sanction. And yes, that is quite a pointed comment at this time. I know that there is literature that's been handed out speaking about the type of sanction. And for me, that is a very necessary component of how artists and an art city that looks to be sustainable, not just in its current interest from outside, but from within, it needs to be able to challenge its own parameters. And for me, that is really my understanding of the nature of the avant-garde. And so, without further ado, after a very long preamble, I'd like to start with Minette, who works in multimedia, who works very performatively. You can rally with one of your colleagues here to change places if you like. But I'd just like a sense of how you operate and what your starting point is within Johannesburg as a particular context, and in terms of still making work that is shown in a formal commercial gallery, as well as in academic institutions. What are your parameters, and where do they begin, end, or become porous?
Porous. Good. Okay. I think global dynamics change all the time, and if you look at the development of 20th century art, the high modernism. It came from a state of flux when industrial revolution was upon Europe and then swiftly migrated to the USA. And of course, it's fueled by global conflict and wars, and we will see that also the First World War, as well as the Second, created an influx of artists and writers and poets into the USA, which then made, New York into one of the global art capitals of the world. And this gains momentum. It takes a very long time to kind of wear off, but it's wearing off. Actually, I think it has, which is why a book like this is being published now. Coming to the point of Johannesburg, I think what is very pertinent at this point is that all the cities that are represented in this book are places where things are in flux. South Africa has been in transition. Yes, there was a swift transition to democracy in the early 90s, but truth be told, we are still dealing with all of the fallout from that. The place where I come from is in fact not Johannesburg. I was born in the capital of this country, the heartland of apartheid. Grew up in Pretoria. And you will see that sometimes in a place where you find a sense of authoritarian rule, the society there develops a strange kind of undercurrent, where subversion is not just an option, but an obligation. And this is the sensibility. And, well, by the way, you will find that many artists, important artists, interesting artists, have actually come from that kind of fold. And yes, I have had to emigrate from Pretoria. And I'm not going to go on and on about it, but yes.
Survivors.
So I've ended up, I've been in Johannesburg a resident for almost 15 years. And what I find interesting is that I said global dynamics change, and I think what drives these dynamics, the reasons why things are always in flux, do also change, and what makes us go forward would not perhaps be, the same as what would make the world go forward in 1913, just before the First World War. But there are other things going on, and these, what I find in all of these cities is there's an influx of, or there's an idea of people coming in from outside. There's the idea of the outsider, not just as artists, but as normal people migrating. There's a culture of migration, and that is very particularly true of Johannesburg. People passing through. We've just seen the tragic events in Kenya, which involves a woman who has used a South African passport to travel into South Africa several times and then to pursue her nefarious business. And there's a sense of, transgression, a sense of subversion. And subversion can be good and it can be bad. But I think art is something that kind of, it always looks to the cracks in society. It always looks to the cracks in the order of things. And then that's where its business starts. It's like a fungus. It starts there and it builds up from there. Okay, there's lots of things, but I don't want to hog the microphone. I'm going to put Dineo on the spot immediately.
Thanks, Manette. Hi, my name is Dineo, and I guess picking up kind of from where you left off about a city having so many multiple stories that are present, I'm reminded of a line from a book by Salman Rushdie. I think it was in the Satanic Verses, where he was speaking about how in the same city you have, in the same street, there's the possibility of having Satanists and saints and Nazis and Buddhists and yoga experts and all these mixed possibilities in one story, which I guess is perhaps the idea of some cities, or most cities, that it can't be one story. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say. I live in Johannesburg, but it's not a city that I'm completely faithful to. Neither is elsewhere where I was born. But I'll pass the mic on to somebody else, and I'll jump in here and there. Cool.
Good evening. I agree with what has been said to an extent also. I do feel that a publication like this, in addition to a lot of upcoming events, the 154 Art Fair, the increase in publications having to do with contemporary art from non-Western locales. So, can you guys hear me? There we go. Certainly demonstrates a shift. However, I feel as though this shift is merely an early beginning. I think that, like this book, many other platforms for exploring non-Western cities and their art are still coming from the West. And I'd agree with what was said in actually the last panel, that more work needs to be done in these locales that are in flux, so that, as Dineo said, we get more than one view of what's happening now and the predictions of what's to come.
Before I pass on to you, I think it's also important to mention about Ayanda Mabulu's painting that it was taken off, and I think it's really a shame that the art fair has censored an artist like that. Okay, I'll pass on the mic again.
Hello. I like the book because it essentially says that the first world is dead, and everything interesting lies on the periphery, perhaps, or in the cities that you don't know about or don't really think about because they're weird, dangerous, crazy. You know, that's all I have.
I'm not entirely sure that you're going to get off the hook that easily. I mean, I would like to pick up on the Ayanda Mbuli sanction, because for me it is a moment of real distress. I mean, Toa's point that the shift is at a very early beginning, I think becomes evident when that happens. I think it becomes evident that the freedom to express and critique and comment freely, openly, and show freely and openly is actually not a given. I think that's been demonstrated to us very substantially over the past year, not just in relation to Ayanda's previous work of the president, or to the Brett Murray saga, or recent films that have been sanctioned by the Films and Publications Board, and the information bill, which, you know, as much as it seemed to have been held in check momentarily by the president not signing it through, it seems that that was not signed through for mere grammatical issues rather than conceptual ones. And it does, I think for me, that does raise the question of where in the face of sanction do artists continue to work and continue to ask questions. I think that one of my difficulties in terms of locating the avant-garde in relation to South Africa is that the avant-garde for me has a very particular reference, which is why I said it felt like a bit of an anachronism to me, but it was really about trying to explore what is prepared to risk going beyond sanction, what artists do because that is what they're interested in doing, rather than trying to placate comfort or simply be repetitive within a market and for an audience who might be self-sanctioning, because I think that is what is starting to happen. My sense is that the sanction that existed here for Ayanda's work really has a lot to do with the art fair's self-sanction. And, you know, as the previous panel was speaking about, inevitably art is related to money. There are funders at stake. There's media at stake. There is next year's contributors to the fair who are going to make decisions around their association. But I think that it is something that is really of very necessary consideration to all of us. If Johannesburg, Lagos, Bogota, Delhi, or any city in the world is going to be considered a sustainable space for critique and for art making, and that goes beyond the parameters of visual decor and that which matches the sofa. And that for me is very concerning, because when formal bodies, which the art fair essentially has become, start to concede to those very cautious requirements, I think that we're in trouble. Or otherwise, as Manette was saying, those states of flux, or the obligation to be subversive in the face of sanction, actually starts to develop really interesting possibilities. Tayo.
Just as a response, you know, in thinking about the context of Lagos and criticism, because I think that sanctioning is very close in meaning to criticism in the context of art, and I feel that sanctioning can be a very blunt and crude form of criticism. I think we need more dialogue to develop the level at which we critique works of art, so that we can see the value in works that we may not necessarily feel we can back for whatever reason, whether it would compromise sponsorship of a certain amount to make a fair or an exhibition possible.
To ask her what's Lagos like? Is it like hardcore? I've never been there. What's it like?
What is Lagos like? I don't know that I can even explain that or begin to, because I think my experience as an artist in Lagos is very different from, you know, other, and I think that any artist can make that argument. I moved to Lagos 2 years ago from New York City. I was born and raised in the United States, and I now live in Lagos full-time and make my work there. And so, of course, my perspective of Lagos is very different from someone who has grown up in Nigeria or someone who's grown up in Lagos their entire life. But we are a city that is about 928 kilometers, somewhere around there, and we're approaching 20 million people. We are about, just to give you some perspective, London, I think, is about 1,000 and something square kilometers, and they have 9 million or something like that people. So it's a very dense city. It's a very intense city. I think people are motivated to do to the best of their ability, because you have to survive, no matter what your area of expertise may be. And I think that that certainly spills over into the visual art sector. We have quite a range of visual artists approaching their practices from many different perspectives, from those who come out of modern, what some may define as modern African art traditions, and then those who are sort of more contemporary. And I think that in the section on Lagos that's in the book, Antoine, who's the curator who selected the artists for our section, tried to really give a diverse perspective. So he didn't really, and I think that's really interesting. I don't think other curators would have chosen the same artist for various reasons. I think some curators may have gone with our modern masters, several of whom are still alive, whose works sell for the most at auction, rather than taking a risk, really, and going with some contemporary artists who don't sell work in a year. So I encourage all of you to read the section on Lagos and learn a bit about our city too, so you can contextualize it.
Can I just very quickly ask you a question around the type of provision and allowance to show work, first of all, in Lagos, and also how critical the city has become for you? I mean, you've only been there for 2 years. In a sense, your lineage is Nigerian, but your being has existed and developed elsewhere. What is the impetus that is offered to you in Lagos? And is it a different kind of impetus to what you were experiencing in New York?
Absolutely. I think both New York City and Lagos are challenging cities for artists, but for me, I got bored in New York City. It became flat for me. It became overdeveloped. And I sort of felt that it was too separated from the real, from what some may call the funk of life. And I found that in Lagos. I think that transitioning to Lagos for me, though there are certainly some trajectories that have continued from the beginning of my work through the present, I think being in Lagos has forced me to think about engaging a much larger public, just because, well, there are more people, there are far more people present, and the art community is far smaller. And so that irony is something that really frustrates me. And in my work, I've tried to use what I find to be everyday platforms as canvases, blank canvases for my work, in the hope of engaging a broader public, but also as a challenge to me as an artist. So, I don't know, did I answer everything?
Okay, just to, because I want to just make a statement later about the painting that's been banned from the art fair. But, what you've just said, Tayo, is that it is about making do. It's about making plans. I think the most interesting art, the most interesting literature, poetry, or I'm talking about all the arts, happen in a place where not everything is possible. Either that be in a political or logistical way, and where people have to build their own bridges between practices and between what is possible and what is not, and making plans. And often these things are underground and underhand and, slightly, to the left of what is, correct or allowed. So I think, I grew up in a place where it wasn't really the thing to do to criticize. It wasn't really the thing to do to challenge. And of course, I think when a certain kind of people that I think all artists in a way are a family in a way, because we have something in common, and that is, do not tell us we can't do something, because then that is going to be the thing that we desire. That's on the top of the list, okay? Which brings me to Ayanda Mbuli. Whatever my personal feelings are about his painting, Still, I find, well, on the way here, I heard an interview that was conducted with him on the radio. And I just feel it's completely out of place. What has been decided by way of removing the painting from view from this art fair is completely in contrast to Johannesburg being included in a book like this. I think it's shameful and very sad. Also what was said was that the painting was removed to not upset politicians. But politicians upset us every day. And sponsors. But honestly, I think, that kind of thing, you'll see throughout history, whenever there's a period of upheaval, of transition, of a culture of governance which is being challenged and being brought to feel somewhat insecure, the first people being banned are poets, artists. You had in the Soviet Union, avant-garde music, composers and poets being sent to labor camps because of the kind of art they produced. Because of, it was abstract art. It was something, what was it called? Entartete Kunst. It means art that has kind of become perverse in some way, that is then not allowed. And, and in that case, it wasn't even something that depicts anything. In particular, it's just an aesthetic sensibility. But even in that, it becomes so challenging that it needs to be put away, out of sight. And that makes us, our blood boil. That makes us want to do more dangerous things.
I think that's something I want to pick up. It makes your blood boil and it inspires you to do more dangerous things. How do all of you imagine one competes with such sanction? I mean, obviously, at one level, you continue creating. At the same time, what we spoke about in the beginning is that part of the requirement for art to exist in the world is for it to exist with an audience. And that becomes an incredibly insidious space where the potential for art to be made but not seen, or to be critiqued where it cannot be published, goes way beyond sanctioning a single work of art, innocuous or offensive to whomever, whatever the case may be. And I just, I'm interested to hear how you all respond to something like that, especially within your own work. I mean, I know that the nature of this book has identified artists and curated artists who specifically go beyond that which is safe, who kind of thumb their noses and give the finger to, what is allowed to be and what is not allowed to be. And so, that kind of precludes you in the type of art that you do. But how does one, because I think that there's something very bizarre in that audience and the market actually looks for provocation. I think it is the structures that surround and expose the art that feel very precious around maintaining some kind of safe delineation around what they should protect you from.
I guess with how does one deal with prohibition, or and how do I deal with it in my work? Perhaps sometimes it's dancing around something, or playing a character of like the madman, where if you're mad, you're then allowed to say whatever you want to say. And if you are pretending to be sane and walking straight, then it becomes perhaps problematic. Or but then you also want to shift those spaces as well, like occupy both mad and sane, so that not everything you say becomes a joke or remains a joke, that some things are heard or are said in a language that's normal. Yeah, that's a start.
What?
Zander, as a man,
As a man, what's the question?
to respond.
To respond.
Danae was saying that one of the possibilities for her is to take on the persona of a man, in which case she can actually explore and do. So being the representative Y chromosome on the panel, just,
It's kind of none of my business. That's my response.
The madness part.
It's I don't. Unfortunately, I'm from a place where I don't feel that it's any of my business, and I live in a little world on the fringe, and I mind my own business, and like I don't know, I suppose politics and the world of people. Like I'm not really interested in anything other than doing whatever my heart desires, and maybe that's a cop out at some level, but at the same time, like it's too exhausting. Like it's not something I'm keen to be doing. Like I want to spend the whole day painting and making weird whatever I don't want to fight any, I don't know.
But then this directly relates to you as well, because if you're showing your work here and the fair director, the fair owner, comes and takes away your work and says this is inappropriate, it's politics that involve you, or all politics involve you at the end of the day. As an artist, we're always implicated. When it happens to another artist, there's a possibility that, yeah.
But the funny thing is always the best press comes from being censored and stuff. So generally, it's really good for an artist's career if their work get taken, because then suddenly everybody's interested.
I think this is a moment to then critique the art fair. Perhaps it's not particularly about the artist then, yeah, because then it's
But remember, it's a corporate event. It's not a biennale. It's not a.
even Biennale is corporate too.
But it's corporate. I mean, I'm not saying I'm for or against. I'm just saying. I don't know. Like, you know what I mean? It's an art fair. Maybe they have something interesting to say.
No, I think it's as artists, as contemporary African artists, however people sort of categorize us. Oftentimes, I feel that artists are expected to take on, the whole world. And I think
the
at the
world
end,
is placed upon you. Like you don't even have a choice at
I
it.
pick what I want to, because honestly, because you just go crazy. I think.
But then this affects you. If somebody comes and says, "Give me your chair," now, get off the chair right now. Yeah, how do you respond to that?
But maybe it was their chair. Maybe you're sitting in their chair.
But you paid to sit on the chair.
No, but then it's a different story. But
Because I think whatever gallery it is paid to be in the fair. Yeah. So it's like
they censored themselves.
no, the fair director censored them. Yeah. They came and took away the painting. It wasn't yeah.
Then it's quite interesting then.
I think it's so much more attention. I mean, look at the amount of time we spent talking about it. If it was on the wall, I didn't even see it, to be honest. But now I've asked you to write down the name of the artist because I want to see it.
What does this stuff look like? When is it? Is it
See?
it's a nude painting of Zuma again? No. Oh, about that.
I mean, I just want to. I think that, Zander, you describe your position as being not interested in or being involved specifically with the nature of what appeals to you and what interests you in pursuing that. But I think that is a point of positionality. And I think that your positionality also very consciously reflects on what has come before, art historically, which is very often a political, whether it is overtly, I think for me there's a difference between the political and the activist, where in fact one's positionality just by exclusion can in fact position you in terms of what you believe in and what you will continue to pursue, which takes a type of defiance because you are unswayed by anybody else telling you what you should be doing. And I think that that is, in fact, a very powerful ideological position to hold.
Spoiled ballot rather than voting is what you're saying it is.
No, I don't think it's like a spoiled ballot.
Instead of not going to vote, you spoil the ballot.
No, I think you're making very clear decisions around what you are doing. You're not indifferent. A spoiled ballot, as much as it doesn't go one way or the other, also speaks of an activist, it's a resistance, but based within a type of, there's resistance, but there also may well be an indifference, which may be a political standpoint. And I don't think that your standpoint is indifferent.
I don't know. Well, I don't know.
Who am I to contradict you?
I don't know. Do you guys have something? I'm boring. She's got lots of interesting things to say. Yes. Yes.
Okay, coming from the perspective of South Africa, look, my career took off in the early, middle 90s. So, and at the time, it was really the thing to be very, very aware of this, transition and very responsive to that. And not necessarily responsible, but responsive. And it became a little bit of a vogue thing to have to be political. And, a perception and an expectation was growing that as a South African artist, certainly you have to be talking about certain issues. Now, we all have our own perspectives. We all, as an artist, every artist develops his or her own language. And we speak to these issues with that tongue that we develop. So to me, in a way, strangely enough, to then decide to do work that is not necessarily overtly speaking to these issues, not overtly being political, is avant-garde already. And it is in a way subversive to then connect back to other things, other cultures, other mythologies, or your own ones that you've invented, to create new narratives that in an oblique way challenge the status quo. I think that is quite important. But, I was asking myself, what does avant-garde mean in the 21st century? What on earth does it mean? I mean, it's such an old term, and certainly it's crying out to be reinvented. Yes?
Hello. It's like the same as like the term punk. Punk happened, it's over, but it's always gonna. So it's the same music as visual art, it's a sensibility, which, I mean, everyone always says avant-garde's dead and whatever, but it's like it's just a recurring idea or a recurring mood, and sometimes even if things are not, you can't say they're avant-garde because technically, I mean, we're not avant-gardes. We're just a bunch of contemporary artists from Joburg. It's a nice way to frame it, but it's a strain of like a sentiment, which I think is cool, which should always kind of keep going, just like punk,
No, I agree. I think, what I was then thinking about was that avant-garde is not necessarily a way of making art or, a particular language, but it is something that occurs and migrates to wherever there's something to be fought for. And, that's basically where avant-garde goes. It's drawn to trouble like a
Goes
magnet.
to war to die, like the French, the first avant-garde people. Oh no, was it the Futurists?
Yeah.
They were. I always thought that was funny. They were like changing
yeah,
the
they
world,
had this
and
very-
they all died in the war.
They had this
You
very
know,
subversive
that's like
manifesto,
the
like
early
pages
20s.
of it, yes?
Yeah, and they were like, yeah, you know. Anyway,
I'm just aware of the fact that we're needing to finish up. But I think that gives us a really nice point to end on, which is that avant-gardism isn't a style. In fact, it is precisely the decision to not adhere to necessarily a single position or a single perspective or a single requirement that comes externally to the artist, always about some kind of self decision making. It is a type of incredible independence of production, of thought, of existence.
it's not just a hand lotion; it's a lifestyle.
I'm going to move on straight away.
I'm also reminded of, I guess, what you said earlier about a state where everything is permissible, that perhaps some things develop further when there are some things where there's some limits. But thinking about Marquis de Sade and his writing, that he was writing all these things that were not permissible, what of that, and what kind of a place would it be if everything was permissible? I'm not saying that it would be a horrible place or the most ideal place, but how do we imagine a place or a space where everything is able to exist? Yeah.
I think going back to what you had mentioned a few moments ago, Tracy, I think that and you also, Xander, about avant-garde and it being a way of life. I think it's forever attached to its history as well, and I think that's what makes this publication interesting, and the use of avant-garde in the title interesting also.
Final word.
Well, I think I'm done. We're talking about the avant-garde, but I think the avant-garde is it's a state of being in which you are constantly in evolution. It minds itself. I think this is going to sound strange, but it's like a creature that digs out its own entrails and displays it to the world. And there's I think. An unstoppable and inexhaustible, what do you call it? An inexhaustible profusion of that, and it exists through every one of our languages. And if you go through this book, you'll see that there are so many different visions of that, so many different, completely widely diverse ways of working through this. So how do you gather something up? I think, in a way, making a book like this is, in fact, quite, cheeky. Because how do you put avant-garde between the covers of a book? So, in fact, the book should come with, once you've read it, burn this.
Or with entrails. Well, thank you all for staying to a far later time zone than was anticipated for the session. But thank you, huge thank you to all of you for being here. It's been incredibly exciting to consider, write about, and be challenged by what you all produce and the ways in which you challenge me as one of your audience members to respond and to think. And I would encourage you all to go and check out the book at Clark's bookstore. It is readily available, and there's really, the curators are a really interesting mix of people who have curated artists that go really, they're incredibly eclectic. There's nothing that pins them all together other than the fact that they choose to do what they do as artists. And that for me is what the sustainability is for a city like Johannesburg, a city like Lagos, or any other city that still produces artists that can claim independence and challenge the status quo. So thank you very much.